unusual. The more bizarre the legend, the more likely it is that you will find him investigating it. This afternoon, Chad will showcase his on-site investigations from the Bigfoot of the North Woods and the lake monster of Lake Pepin to phantom chickens and hellhounds roaming rural Wisconsin. Note that Chad will be available to sign books immediately following this presentation. So everybody please welcome Chad Lewis.
Well, hello and welcome everyone. If we could get the lights turned down, please. First of all, I'd like to thank the festival for having me back here again this year. But just as important, all of you who were brave enough to show up to talk about Wisconsin creatures here in the safety of daylight. My name's Chad Lewis. I'll be your presenter for this program. And although my background is actually in the field of psychology, I've spent the last 30 years traveling the world in search of the strange and unusual. Everything from hunting for vampire legends in Transylvania, looking for the Loch Ness Monster, crop circles, UFOs, alien abductions, some really scary people, well, some creepy places, you name it. If it's just offbeat, I've traveled around looking for this folklore, the weird anomalies. But what I discovered in my travels is that sometimes the weirdest things happen right in your own backyard. So that's what we're going to explore this afternoon. You can sit back and relax. For the next 45 minutes or so, I'll provide you everything you need. I'll give you the background, the folklore, the eyewitness accounts. I'll talk a bit about my research at these places. Heck, I'll even provide you the directions to get to these places. But I'm going to leave it up to each and every one of you to travel to these places on your own and determine for yourself whether or not you believe the legends are true. So with that, let's explore some of the weirdest creatures that Wisconsin has to offer. First stop, UFOs, alien abductions, hot in the news, all the releasing of all the videos of UFOs and encounters. And it should come as no surprise that we get reports of UFOs here in Wisconsin. Because here not only do we have the UFO capital of the world, we have 3 of them in Wisconsin. The towns of Bellevue, Elmwood, and Dundee all claim to be the UFO capital of the world. They all have UFO Day festivals where you can go and relax and get a UFO burger if you choose. But there's a reason why we have UFO days. We have a lot of UFO encounters. Perhaps the weirdest you will ever hear happened in Eagle River, a small touristy town up north. 1961, it happened to this gentleman, Joe Simonton, a part-time plumber and a farmer who was having a late breakfast one morning when all of a sudden he noticed this thing start to descend into his yard. He said it was about 30 feet wide, 12 feet high, had all these little muffler rings on it. Have to give Simonton credit because he had never given much thought to UFOs, so he wasn't terrified, he was curious. He walked out to see this thing in his yard as it was hovering. And as he did, an opening appeared on the craft. He said, like the trunk of your car coming up. And to the front came one of the inhabitants, the pilot, the alien, the human, whatever it was. Simonton could see 2 more beings on board. They were all identical looking, dressed in weird outfits, very short, dark hair, dark skin, dark eye. Simonton said they reminded him of small Italian men. Now, Simonton sees that they have a jug and realizes they want water. Without any verbal communication, he realizes they want water. So he goes to his house, fills the jug with water, comes back. And as he does, he looks inside, and one of these things seemed to be cooking something over a flameless type grill. So trying to get some communication, he hands the water and he motions like eating. Is that what you're eating? The leader recognizes his interest, walks over and trades him for the water, giving him what the media were calling pancakes from outer space. Told you this was going to be weird. He ate one of them, said it was the worst tasting pancake he'd ever had. He said, no wonder these things are so small. I feel sorry if this is what they're eating. Meanwhile, he had no idea, but while he was swapping pancakes for water with UFO occupants, People from around the area were calling in, reporting a UFO in the vicinity of Simonton's farm. As soon as the deal was concluded, the craft simply closed its door as though it was never there and flew off out of sight. Simonton didn't want to make the report. Someone overheard him talking about it. It got to the media. Immediately, thousands of people showed up on his farm looking for those alien pancakes. Till the day he died, he believed he had encountered something not of this world. But like a lot of witnesses, especially with UFOs and abduction scenarios, he wished he never would have reported. The backlash from the media and fellow citizens was too much. He wished he would have just remained quiet. But Simonton's not the only one seeing weird things around Wisconsin. Now today, the most popular creature out there is probably that of Bigfoot. Known throughout the world as the Bigfoot, the Yeti, the Yowie, the Sasquatch, the Abominable Snowman. When most people think of these creatures, they often think of the heavily forested western forests. Don't often think of the Midwest. But here in Wisconsin, we get a lot of reports of people seeing something they simply can't explain. One of my favorites happened back in 2000 in Granton. It happened to this gentleman just outside of Neillsville. James Hughes. He was a farmer, but also delivered bulk newspapers in the morning. One morning, as he had done hundreds and hundreds of times before, he was driving back to his house on a road he knew very well. It was just breaking sunlight, and up in the distance, he saw what appeared to be a bear walking across the road. As he got closer, he slowed down, didn't want to hit it or swerve off the road, and when he got close enough to make out what it was, he realized it wasn't a bear at all. He said it was a giant Bigfoot creature. He estimated it to be at least 8 feet tall. He told me it was carrying something in his arm, like a dead deer or a goat. He didn't get a good look at the carcass because he was more frightened of the creature's eyes. So much so, he almost drove his car into the ditch. Then he drove home, told his wife about it. He didn't want to report it, nobody would believe him, but the next day he made the report just in case. Sheriff's deputy came out, looked for any footprints, any hair, any scat, nothing out of the ordinary. But after he came forward, many of his neighbors started talking to him saying, "We saw the same thing. We were just afraid to report it." Now, Mr. Hughes said there might have been something in his arm. When I went to interview him just a couple days after his sighting, I noticed he lived right down the road from a farm with a bunch of livestock. So I did ask the farmers if they were missing any livestock. Thankfully, they were not. James Hughes, again, to the day he died, believed he had encountered a Bigfoot-like creature. But again, he wished he wouldn't have reported it because at that time, the media was not quite as open to it as they are today. So you have a standard Bigfoot scenario. Standard sighting, 8 feet tall, covered in thick, matted down hair. But this next story is a little twist on that. And for that, we head to a small town called Steinthal, Wisconsin. Now, you've probably never heard of the town of Steinthal because there's not much there anymore. It's pretty much a ghost town. But in the 1970s and 80s, this was the hotbed of paranormal activity in Wisconsin. Mainly thanks to this old abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of town. Teenagers mostly would go out there. They thought it was haunted. It was far from the prying eyes of law enforcement or their parents, so they could go out there and have fun. They would go out to the house and claim that they would see lights moving inside, but when they walked in, nothing was there. They could hear the voices of people talking inside the home. But again, when they walked in, all they found was a little mannequin set up to scare one another inside the house. So you had this haunted home attracting people out there. But then the legend started to grow because around the house, it was surrounded by swamp wetland, which you can kind of see here in this grainy newspaper photo of the time. That's when people started seeing what they said was a giant Bigfoot-like creature. Again, 400 pounds, 7 feet plus in height. But this one was a little bit different because they reported this Bigfoot had glowing green eyes. And when I say eyes, I mean eyes. 3 of them to be exact. This creature had 3 glowing eyes. They had no idea what to call this thing, so they called it the Steinthal thing. Eventually, word started spreading. Now, during that time, people would gather around the Steinthal Tavern. This is what it looked like way in the old days. It's no longer there. It's now where this religious chapel is. But people would gather at the Steinthal Tavern, sit outside, and wait with their drinks for the Steinthal monster to appear. I assume that's why they were there, because the only thing I could find about the Steinthal Tavern was this never-ending series of advertisements for exotic dancers being there. I'm sure they were there for the monsters, because right across the street where my colleague Kevin Nelson is standing is the old mill where a lot of the sightings took place of the creature. But here's the interesting part, that Kevin and I researched this place recently, talked to a few of the remaining residents. There have been no known recent sightings of this thing. So it begs the question of, was it ever there? Is it still there? Did it migrate off somewhere else? I'll leave it up to you to head to Steinthal and decide for yourself. So these would be considered traditional sightings of Bigfoot, UFOs, and if you thought those cases were bizarre, and granted they were, these next cases are going to be beyond bizarre. Not too far out of Green Bay is a place called Shawano. And outside of Shawano is a place called Chicken Alley, the mysterious Chicken Alley. Because it is said that when you go here, the street sign will vanish right before your eyes, will disappear, and you will not be able to catch a photograph of it. It's also here that people will be driving down the small stretch of rural road when all of a sudden they see what appears to be a weird light coming toward them, either directly in front of them or approaching very fast from behind. Once the light gets close enough to make out who or what it is, it seems to be that of a phantom snowmobile that vanishes right into thin air. To make matters even more bizarre, I get a lot of these phantom lights and snowmobiles from the area in the heart of our summer. That's when reports come in. But the story gets even better, and that involves the legend of Chicken Alley, because it is said, if that's a call from the deceased, let me know. I get reports of those all the time. All right, so people will be driving down this road when all of a sudden, out of nowhere, they report phantom chickens will appear. Well, actually, not quite. They think they're real chickens. They brake, they hit the roadkill, they get out to see the damage to find that there are no chickens there. Others have seen what appear to be flesh and blood chickens crossing the road, when all of a sudden they vanish right into thin air as though they're not there. People are so convinced they've run over a flesh and blood, real-life chicken that they've even inquired with local residents to see if anyone's missing any of their chickens. But the story gets even better than phantom chickens, and that involves the crossroads between Chicken Alley and French Road. Now, any student of folklore is going to recognize the significance of a crossroads. Folklore tells that if you ever wanted to sell your soul to the devil, the deed would be done at a crossroads. That's where the bargain would be completed. So it only seems fitting that the dare tells that if you're brave enough or foolish enough to walk out into the middle of the crossroads, you will hear the angry voice of a ghost yelling at you to get out of the road, get out of the road. If you do not heed his advice, it is said, you will have bad luck until the day you die. So you have this opportunity to see all sorts of weird phenomena, all right there on this little stretch of road called Chicken Alley. But maybe phantom chickens aren't scary enough for you. For that, maybe you have to head right outside of my hometown of Eau Claire to a small little island called Merrydean or Meriden if you're a local. A long history and mystery of this location. The island itself was named Merrydean after the legend of a young girl that was said to have drowned on a steamboat, and she was buried in an unmarked grave on the island. Now, it is said that she haunts the waterways like a siren, patrolling the water, trying to entice you in to help her. In fact, many people have drowned in this very area every year. I've interviewed their friends and family who told me they were drawn to that area for some unknown reason. And the siren of this Mary Dean will say things like, "Help me, save me, I can't swim, I'm drowning, don't leave me." And legend tells if you're foolish enough to go out, she will grab you and pull you under, and you'll meet your watery grave and spend eternity in the river with Mary Dean. At one time, an entire town lived out on the island. You had to get there by ferry and back. They had businesses, a post office, and a doctor. One legend tells that the doctor had some dogs, and they mauled some children. So the dogs had to be put to death. And now, so many years later, the legend tells that if you pull your car into the parking lot of the Mary Dean boat landing, not only will you see the ghost of Mary Dean, her siren, you might also encounter what many people are calling the hellhounds of Mary Dean. If you're not familiar with hellhound legends, they reportedly throughout history in many cultures around the planet, usually large black dogs with glowing red or green eyes. Many cultures believe they do the devil's bidding, that they are a harbinger of death, that they guard portals to hell, and on and on and on. Here, they reportedly will show up when you go there and check out the boat landing. After a program I did in Stevens Point, a big burly biker guy came up to me. You know, the type of guy you wouldn't think would get spooked by anything. Told me him and his buddies took their motorcycles out there one day to see the ghost of Mary Dean. But when they got there, he said they were surrounded by hellhounds. When I asked him why he thought they were hellhounds and not just wild black dogs, he said 3 things stood out about these creatures. 1, they had glowing red eyes. Not an eye shine, not a reflection. It was though embers of hell were emanating from the creature itself. 2, they were nearly transparent. He could almost see right through them. And 3, it wasn't until they took off on their motorcycles and these things could keep up with him that he went to kick one and his big biker boot went right through it and they finally disappeared. Even though this had occurred a couple years before he told me it, he was shaking while he was telling me the story. He was so frightened and vowed never to return to the island. But there's good news for you. If you want, you can camp on the island. You don't need to register. You don't need to pay. You can just camp out there if you so choose. Take it from me, it's highly suggested that you do go out there. I've camped there with my colleague Todd Roll and others who are here today, and luckily we're still here. Great place. You may have to worry about all the ticks more than the hellhounds, but still an adventure if you're looking for hellhounds. So as you saw, I spent a couple weeks over in Romania looking for vampire legends. Little did I know I should have stayed in Wisconsin. Well, right up the road in Mineral Point, that is. See, in 1981, Mineral Point was overrun with vampires. It all began when police officer John Pepper was patrolling late at night. He passed by the Graceland Cemetery when all of a sudden he noticed what appeared to be a very tall, very pale, very thin, very ugly vampire, complete with a cape. He gave chase to this vampire, where he said it easily flew or jumped over a side fence and vanished into the night. He didn't want to make this report. He knew how it sounded, but he was on duty. He made the report, and as you can imagine, the very next day, media from all over the country descended upon Mineral Point looking for the Mineral Point vampire. It got to be so much that Officer Pepper quit the police force, moved out of that town, and refused to talk about the case ever again. I've contacted him several times, never heard a response to any of my inquiries about what he saw or didn't see that night. But once word started spreading, people started seeing vampires all over, jumping out of every shadow, nook and cranny in Mineral Point. It got to be so much that tourists were going there to see the vampire. Now, I don't know if the police chief believed the story, or maybe he was having fun with the semantics, because he told the newspaper that he was offering his officers overtime to stake out the place, but none of them would bite on his offer. Believe it or not, people still to this very day report seeing a vampire in the cemetery or Monroe Point. Now, I've been to that cemetery both day and night, summer, winter. I've never been attacked by a vampire, but then again, I bring my vampire hunting kit with me just in case. So vampires, now we have vampires and Bigfoot, UFOs. Why not keep it going with some more weirdness? And for that, we turn to my late friend and colleague, Linda Godfrey. Now, thanks to Linda's original research, Wisconsin is now known as the werewolf capital of the world. It all began when Linda was working as a journalist in southeastern Wisconsin, in Elkhorn. She started receiving reports of people traveling down the small stretch of road called Bray Road. There, sometimes at night, sometimes in the day, people would be traveling down the road when all of a sudden they would see, for a lack of a better term, a werewolf standing on the side of the road. Anywhere from 5 to 8 feet tall, pointed ears, pointed snout, the claws, biped running upright on his hind legs like you and I do, covered in a thick matted down fur. Sometimes it was seen eating roadkill or freshly killed prey on the side of the road. Once Linda's books came out, people started reporting these things from all over the country, eventually even adapting or adopting the name of dogmen to some of these creatures as well. But outside of charging at a couple vehicles, it seems as though these creatures are just as afraid of witnesses as witnesses are of them. And rather than try to kill and devour people, they seem more likely to scurry back into the underbrush and remain undetected. So the good news is, if you go looking for these creatures, most likely you're not going to die. Well, 50-50, but still pretty good odds when you're out werewolf hunting. Alright, enough werewolves. They seem to be everywhere these days. I love this next story because it's even more bizarre than a werewolf. And it seems like something that you would see the plot to if you went to a 1950s horror drive-in movie. It's just so bizarre. A lot of places have these roads in their town that people avoid at all costs. Places you just don't want to drive through. And if you're in the New London area of Wisconsin, you'll know that place as Marsh Road. The road seems to have all sorts of paranormal activity occurring on it. Now, it's named Marsh Road because on each side of the road is heavy marshland. And it's here the road is thought to be alive. People claim that if you drive down one direction, it'll be a certain mileage. But when you drive back, the road will have expanded or contracted and will be a different length. People have all sorts of electrical problems with their vehicles out there. Batteries will die, cars will need to be towed out. Brand new vehicles have trouble and have to get jump started just to get out of the area. But my favorite legend dates back until at least the 1950s. It may predate it, but that's as far back as I found this legend. And it involves the local homecoming king and queen. It was said that during October, sometime in the 1950s, the local king and queen were crowned at the high school. And they decided to go out to Marsh Road to celebrate. But they weren't going out there celebrating to maybe get to know one another. They were going out there in a suicide pact, ending their lives at the end of a rope. And now legend tells that if you venture out there, not only will you see the phantom nooses hanging from a tree and vanishing, but you might also encounter the ghostly spirits of the homecoming king and queen as they make their way down the road. But if this wasn't creepy enough for you, the story gets even better. Because dating back to the same 1950s period, people out there believe something lives out there. something that science says does not exist. Skeptics say it can't exist. Yet every year people were coming face to face with the creature. So what were these people seeing out on Marsh Road? Well, maybe I'd better let you just take a look. This creature called the Goat Man of Marsh Road. Half goat, half human. Which half is which depends on who you speak with as a witness. Some more sinister versions tell that it wasn't suicide that did the homecoming king and queen in. It was the Goat Man that tore them to shreds. And when the police showed up, they saw the gruesome sighting and decided to blame it on suicide so panic would not ensue throughout the area. The only problem is we have no documentation of any kids dying out on that road, whether by their own hand or not. But I can tell you from personal experience, even if you don't believe in ghosts or goat men, when you're walking down the road at midnight by yourself and you hear every little branch or twig breaking in the marshland, your mind is going to conjure up images of that goat man coming to get you. And if you're like me, you'll probably pick up your pace a little bit quicker while walking down Marsh Road all by yourself. This next story is even more bizarre, and this story starts in the most bizarre of all states, Florida. Many years ago, some circus performers, little people, were down in Florida on their off-season from the traveling circus. Their manager was said to be a horrible manager, mean, abused them, so one day they decided to get rid of him forever. And when the deed was completed, they decided to move away to the safety and seclusion of Wisconsin, down a dead-end road near a lake where they could take all of their people and bring them to Wisconsin without the manager and start a little colony. And that's exactly what they said to have done by Muskego, right by the lake. First a few of them, then many, many more. Over the decades, stories started springing up that maybe they weren't even human. They were supernatural creatures living back there. Legend was that they hired an average-sized man to stand guard with a shotgun. Eventually, the town took on the name of Haunchyville, and it was said that you drive through the area and see stop signs at half height, and houses very small, businesses that were short. Of course, some of you will recognize this as a snowmobile trail with a short stop sign as well. I've talked to people who claim that they've been shot at by this protector of the Haunchies. As the years went by, more and more fantastical stories started to spread about the Haunchies, of people going back into the woods and finding entire abandoned villages of stores, all built at about half height of an average store. Didn't help, it was called Mystic Drive that you had to drive down to get to Haunchyville. But here's I think the unfortunate thing over the years is that we have no idea if the story ever had an origin story to it, whether some little people did indeed move out there and these stories started circulating. But more and more, the area around Haunchyville is being built up by McMansions and well-manicured yards of giant homes out there. And it begs the question of what happens to these legends when development steps in. What happens to that haunted forest when it becomes a Target parking lot? And that's what interests me of what happens to these places when the actual geography of them changes. And we'll see with Haunchyville. Maybe 10 years from now, there will be no stories of Haunchyville. But one thing that's not changing are all of our lakes, rivers, and streams. Now here I am on one of my expeditions at Loch Ness looking for the Loch Ness Monster. I'm the one in the blue without the really cool beard. But little did I know, if I wanted to see sea serpents, I should have stayed in Wisconsin. See, in the 1800s, early 1900s, Wisconsin was the hotbed of sea serpent activity. Dozens and dozens of places have monsters. As of today, I've collected nearly 50 different lakes, rivers, and streams in Wisconsin that were thought to have had or have a sea serpent monster in them. Back in those days, if you were a resort town in Wisconsin and you did not have a sea serpent report, you were behind the times. You were losing out on tourists coming up from Chicago that wanted to stay somewhere with a sea serpent story behind it. And you're in luck in Wisconsin. We have a lot of these places, including one of my favorites, the Mississippi River. Now, back in the 1800s, people were terrified of the Mississippi River because there were newspapers saying there were giant monsters living in the water. If you believed all the newspaper accounts, these things were almost 10 feet long, covered in a thick, scale-like armor that a bullet could not even pierce. Parents refused to allow their children to go down by the river to play because the newspapers were claiming there were man-eating fish in the river. What was happening mostly is men were drowning in the water. And when they pulled their bodies out, they found a lot of them had deep scratch marks or claw marks on their calves and ankles, as though something grabbed them, pulled them into their watery grave. Over the years, stories started spreading about Lake Pepin on the Mississippi River. It's a lake on the river. Early indigenous stories tell that the native peoples would only take their strongest and sturdiest canoes out on the water, because every time they capsized or drowned, they blamed it on this hideous sea serpent of Lake Pepin. When the steamboat captains started making their trips up and down the Mississippi, they too reported seeing the strange leviathan of the deep. Eventually, the newspapers started covering these reports. Here's one talking about the creature being between the size of an elephant and a rhinoceros. We have newspaper accounts going back to the Civil War, talking about a monster being in the lake. Over the years, so many people saw this creature that they dubbed it Pepe, the lake monster of Lake Pepin. But don't let these cutesy postcards and t-shirts fool you. Many believe it's a deadly creature. I spoke with a young girl. At the time, she was a teenager when she had the experience in 1983. She was a local, and after all the tourists left for the season, she was water skiing with her brother, just the two of them, back before you needed a third person in the boat. And she was skiing, and she fell off and waited for her brother to spin around to come and get her. While she was sitting in the water, something big brushed up against her. Something bigger, she said, than the 17-foot boat they were on. By the time the brother approached her, she was screaming, "Get me out of the water, there's something here." He thought she was just playing around and joking. But he told me that that moment she vowed never to set foot in Lake Pepin again. And as you can see from 1983 to today, she has not stepped foot back in the waters of Lake Pepin. So we have all sorts of personal encounters like this. But not only have people seen it, some believe they've captured photographic evidence of it, including this long-distance photo of someone saying they saw a neck break out of the water and a long creature 20 or 30 feet, partially submerged, was in the water before they could get close enough to snap a good photo. Well, a few years ago, a man was out fishing with his buddies. He told me they saw what appeared to be a log moving upstream against the current. They thought that was weird, so they motored the boat over there to get a better view. And when they got there, they realized it wasn't a log at all. He snapped this photo of what he thought showed a long-necked, humped-like creature, much like you might consider the Loch Ness Monster. Now, I've been on numerous expeditions to Lake Pepin searching for Pepe, even spending several nights living on a houseboat with noted researcher Noah Voss. As you can see, we had underwater cameras, we had sonar, we had fishing equipment, we had nets. We even jumped in using ourselves as bait. But fortunately, or maybe unluckily for us, Pepe did not make an appearance. But my favorite part of the legend is this. The people of Lake City, Minnesota are so convinced Pepe is real, or at least convinced you'll come looking for it, they are now offering a $50,000 reward for the capture of this monster. As of today, nobody has collected the reward. With the weather we're having this weekend, you could go there tomorrow, capture Pepe, and be back $50,000 the richer. Or maybe you want to head to one of my favorite places in Wisconsin, the aptly named Devil's Punch Bowl, right outside of Menominee, Wisconsin. For years, this has been a place of history and mystery. Most of the sightings here talk about weird balls of light similar to these artist recreations here, where the balls of light will change in size, shape, and maneuver their way through the nature area. I actually spoke with a group of teenagers that were parked in the makeshift lot here, debating whether they should go down into the punch bowl. That's when they saw a ball of light start approaching their vehicle. They told me the ball of light actually went inside their car. And when I asked them, I said, well, what did you do when that ball of light came into your car? They all looked at me as though I was crazy. They said, we got out of the car. But if you do get out, go down to the punch bowl. It's a great nature area, thought to be a sacred area for the indigenous First Nations and Native peoples that were there. All sorts of weird things happen here. Weird balls of light that I mentioned, disembodied voices, apparitions. One legend tells that if you take water from the stream, it will remain cold regardless of what you do to it. Leave it in your car all summer long, it will still be cold. But my favorite story here came from a woman who was hiking with her son. She told me they were hiking and just about to leave, walking up the steps to go back to the parking lot, when all of a sudden she decided to take one last look back at the beautiful waterfall. And when she did, she was amazed to find this creature staring right back at her. She said it was something out of Hollywood. Well, a little gnome, fairy type creature, 3 feet tall, pointed ears, pointed cap. Again, something out of a movie. She immediately grabbed her young son and said, hey, do you see this thing? By the time the sun spun around, the creature had either disappeared through the tunnel or vanished into the forest. She got home, she was a little embarrassed and shy about what she had reported. She knew how it sounded, a gnome in Wisconsin, but she made the report hoping that others would come forward. And she was right. Not long after she told me her story, a UW Stout football player contacted me, told me he was taking his girlfriend down to the punch bowl to really scare her, to get her into the mood for Halloween. They made it about halfway down the steps when they heard some creature growling right off in the distance beside them. His plan worked, except it was the football player who got spooked and ran back to the parking lot. I spoke with the young woman. She told me she sat there for another 15 minutes or so, waiting, hoping that whatever made the noise would appear, but then she felt bad and had to go rescue her boyfriend. Many others have stepped forward recently and told me stories dating back to the 1970s about seeing these little troll-like figures out at the punch bowl. And I always encourage people to go there, because even if you don't run into these creatures, you don't see anything out of the ordinary, you're going to have a beautiful day exploring the nature area of the Devil's Punch Bowl. So, the last creature I'm going to talk about this afternoon is one you might not want to know about. It's certainly one you don't want to say its name, because many cultures believe that merely saying the name of this next thing is enough to put you on its radar. That when you go looking for the weird will come looking for you. Of course, I'm speaking about the cannibalistic monster of the north, the creature known as the Wendigo. Now, fair warning, this last case can get a bit gruesome, graphic, and gory. So if you have young legend trippers here with you, or a squeamish stomach, don't feel bad. Hop out into the lobby, throw a Hallmark Christmas movie on your phone, forget all about this. I will not be offended. Those of you brave enough to stick around, let's explore the Wendigo. It began with the First Nation people of Canada. They knew this thing throughout their country, and it slowly spread to the Great Lakes region of the U.S. and the Northeast as well. They knew it by many different names and many different spellings. And it would show up in times of famine, starvation, when game was nowhere to be found, food was scarce, people were even resorting to cannibalism. And the Wendigo could show up in two forms. One, it could show up as a flesh and blood being, extremely tall, anywhere from 8 feet to as tall as it wanted to be. Thin, skeletal, emaciated, its tight skin pulled over its thin muscles on its body. Sometimes it's missing its own mouth and lips because it has an insatiable hunger for human flesh. And when no prey is around, it will resort to consuming its own body to stay alive. Some say it walks in a straight line because nothing can stop it. Worse yet, it can show up in spirit form and possess you and slowly turn you into a Wendigo as well. We have reports of people killing one another, believing that that person was a Wendigo, that if they wouldn't have killed that person, the Wendigo would have infected the entire town, tribe, or village. And you might be thinking this is nothing more than First Nation lore from 400 years ago from a different country. Well, you might be surprised to find many places here in Wisconsin still claim to have Wendigo sightings, including just north of Spooner, Wisconsin, to an old camp for children called the Leisure Lake Summer Camp. This is a historic, rustic camp. I don't know if parents send their kids there for a punishment or for a reward. That's how old this thing is, authentic Northwoods summer camp cabins. A few years ago for a TV show, I interviewed these two brothers who were staying there during the summer at the summer camp. The oldest brother was in this cabin here with all of the older campers. He was downstairs playing cards and board games one night when all of a sudden they noticed outside the window here, this thing crept by right in front of the window. They immediately got the sense that whatever this thing was, it was there to harm them. They immediately contacted the camp counselors. They took it serious on one hand, but on the other hand, you're at summer camp telling ghost stories around the fire. Every little branch or twig passing by is going to seem like a creature. So they didn't think too much of it. The next night, the story wasn't well known in camp. When the younger brother was going back to his cabin with a friend of his, they were going to get shirts and sweatshirts because it was getting dark and cold. But as they walked up to their cabin, right in the woods here, they saw this thing leaning against a tree, staring at them. He felt like he had walked into a zone of fear. He felt as though if he stepped one step closer to this thing, it was going to kill him, come after him, just waiting, lurking for him and his buddy. They turned around, hightailed it to the camp counselors. They now took it seriously. They implemented a plan that if you left your cabin, you had to do it in pairs. You had to have a partner with you. They didn't know if they were dealing with a bear, a deranged lunatic, or something else, but they were taking precautions. In fact, it was about 3 years prior to me interviewing them that they had that experience, and they were still terrified of it. I interviewed their mother, who told me they still have nightmares of their time at camp. Now what's interesting is they'd never heard of a Wendigo. They went home and Googled what they might have seen and started looking and found a depiction of the Wendigo and said that's exactly what they had spotted. They were convinced, and they're still to this day terrified that it was a harbinger of ill fate, that it was bad luck, that mishap, misfortune, or death was going to follow them. And I love ending on the Wendigo case because a lot of these stories I receive are not from people who are out actively searching for them. They're people who are just going about their business, traveling home, or, I don't know, leaving a book festival on their way home. When they see something out of the ordinary, something they can't explain. And that's where I want all of you to keep an eye out, because you never know when you might be the next to experience one of these strange creatures. So with that, I wanted to save the last few minutes that we have for any questions, comments, or stories that any of you might have. If you want more information, my website has more than you could ever want or need. But I hope your adventure doesn't end here today at the book festival. Grab one of my books. Go on your own adventure of Wisconsin. And when you do, I think you'll discover that we live in one heck of a weird place. And I mean that in a good way. You're going to see things you've never seen. You'll meet some odd characters. And along the way, you might just discover that the strangest thing out there is often yourself. So with that, I'll open it up if you have any questions or comments. Otherwise, you let me off the hook way too easy this afternoon. Maybe if we could get the lights up a bit here. Please. That would be great. Now, keep in mind, thank you. Keep in mind, this is just the tip of the iceberg of monsters that we get reports of here in Wisconsin. There's no end to the weirdness of creatures. You have a question, or are you just stretching out? Yeah, after that program, you need a quick stretch. Any questions, comments, or stories from any of you? Otherwise, I will stick around if you want to ask me a story, or tell me a story in private, or ask a question. Stop out to my table out here, grab as many free postcards from me as you want. You can terrorize your enemies, because that's one of the postcards. But the book festival has surveys here today. So if you like programs like this, let them know so you get more of these programs. If you didn't like today's program, let them know so you get fewer of these. But either way, they put a lot of work into getting me here this afternoon, and they should be applauded, and thank you all for coming. And I'll just be out with photographs and